South Africa has, or the ownership has become an emotive issue that has sparked concerns from many quarters. The debate around land still rages following the recent Parliament's decision to amend the Constitution for expropriation of land without compensation. To discuss this contentious issue, we are joined in our Johannesburg studio by political analyst Professor Steven Friedman from the University of Johannesburg. A very good morning to you, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Essentially, what is your view on what we've just seen there just over the past weekend of land invasion taking place between Johannesburg and Pretoria?
Look, this is not the first time we've had that. We've had organized land invasions from time to time. And very often land invasions are organized by political parties in order to make a point, and the allegation is that this is what happened in this particular instance. I mean, obviously there is a huge housing shortage in this country, in the cities. If people who don't have housing have the opportunity of acquiring it, they will obviously be interested. But I don't think this really indicates that the masses of the South African people are rising up and seizing other people's land. You know, that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of the proposal that has been put forward by the former Minister Gugile Nkutini on the call for the nationalisation of land?
Well, I doubt very much that's going to happen. I mean, if you nationalize land, basically you're taking away everybody's right to land. I mean, including people who own RDP houses, people who own small plots of land, etc. I mean, my guess is that that call is being made as what we call a bargaining position. The minister is saying, well, look, you demand that, and then people say, no, well, that's unacceptable. And then you say, well, how about this as a compromise? So I think in this whole debate about land, we've got to distinguish between real demands and demands which are being made as bargaining positions. I think among supporters of the African National Congress, there would be very little support for the idea of nationalizing land, because many supporters of the African National Congress own homes and the land on which those homes are. So I don't think that's where we're going to end up in this particular case.
Now, you've been quoted as saying that the whole issue about land and land reform and the expropriation thereof is one that has to do with equality and dignity and not the Constitution. Correct me if I'm wrong. And why do you say that?
No, you're right. Well, first of all, there's no, as many people have been pointing out over the last few weeks, in a sense this is a bit of a charade, because there is no need to amend the Constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation, because the Constitution allows it already. People are harping on about Section 25, which is the property clause, which says that compensation must be paid. There is a section in the property clause which says all of that falls away if what you're doing is trying to redress historical injustice. So, in other words, clearly what the land issue is about is historical injustice. So if you want to do that, you don't have to change the Constitution. I don't think this is really about agricultural land. I don't think this is about masses of people who want to own farms. I think this is about people saying this is still an unfair economy, this is still an unequal economy, and we want that to change, which of course is an entirely legitimate point. And the land issue tends to be seized on because in South Africa, land symbolizes a great deal. You know, in the period of apartheid, when liberation movements were fighting for the freedom of this country, they called for the return of the land. They didn't literally mean pieces of soil. They meant the country, they meant the economy, they meant the society. And therefore, the call for land, the reason why so many people are supporting the call for land who aren't interested in farms is because it's about their dignity, it's about their desire for equality.
What do you make then of the EFF then advocating for wholesale expropriation of land or where people were forcefully removed from what they deem ancestral land?
Yeah, but those are two totally different issues. The question of people being forcefully removed from ancestral land is already provided for. Most people believe, myself included, that what has been done about that is not nearly enough. It's been far too slow, it's been far too cumbersome. There are far too many people who are entitled to redress who are not getting it. But that's a very different issue from saying you want to take, as Minister Nkwinti said, I mean, that in effect means that nobody in this country would have the right to property. The state would own all the property. And I don't think that there's terribly much support from that. Let's not forget the EFF gets an enormous amount of media coverage. The EFF got the support of 6% of the population in the last election, 8% in the local election. So that is it's a legitimate point of view. It's a point of view a group of South Africans are entitled to express. But we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that what people who represent 6 or 8% want is what the majority want.
There seems to be, a huge concern around this whole expropriation of land. Is it not necessarily the last step? Isn't there supposed to be a process of a willing buyer versus a willing seller? What are the processes before we actually get to a point where you're taken or you're being told you need to vacate this land?
I think there's a lot of ignorance, there's a lot of confusion about
there
this.
Definitely is,
willing buyer and willing seller was scrapped as government policy by former President Mbeki in I think 2005 or 2006. Government policy, so willing seller, willing buyer means that whoever's selling the land can ask for any price they like, and if they don't get it, they say they're not selling the land. It means they can hold everybody else to ransom. It's obviously an unacceptable policy. The policy which government was pursuing up until now was not willing seller, willing buyer. It was a policy in which you can expropriate, and if the person you're expropriating from doesn't like the price you give them, they can go to the courts. So in other words, the courts would decide what is fair compensation. But you can go the next step in some cases of saying, well, we think fair compensation is no compensation. That's perfectly allowed by the Constitution. What is needed, if we are going to go this route of expropriation without compensation, what you need then is something very clear which says where it happens and where it doesn't happen. Because then you have property rights protected, because it means that if I own property, I know how I have to behave in order to avoid this. And that is acceptable. What would be unacceptable is simply a clause which says there's no restriction on this, the government can do what it likes, because I think that would cause a great deal of tension. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Another issue is, if you're someone that owns, you're on the land, you own property on the land, you own a business on the land, what essentially then happens when this transition takes place? Would the person then be compensated for not necessarily then the land, but the business and the money that you're generating from the business that is on that land? How is
well, you see, this is what has to be negotiated if we're going to go that route at all. Because if you simply say, the state can expropriate without compensation, the state can take the buildings that person built on the land. They can take, because it means that the state can take anything. That's what expropriation without compensation means. Now, you can say that in some circumstances, I mean, interestingly, the EFF is calling but its advocate, its lawyer, who's just written a book, Advocate Toby, has argued that what we need is a clear definition of the circumstances in which you can take land and you can't take land, which is a legitimate point. But that's very different from saying the state can take everything.
And then that brings into the question of the banks. We've been running a story this morning of saying that the land banks could be going into default or liability because of the whole issue around land. If I own land or I have property on a land and I'm paying a bond towards a bank on that property, and now that land is taken away from me, as an individual, can I then say I no longer occupy the land, I'm not in the building anymore, therefore I'm not going to be fulfilling that liability?
Which is why this is not going to happen. If you have simply expropriation without compensation, then you can't have the economy we have at the moment. Because the economy we have at the moment, as the examples you raise keep on pointing out, it's based on property rights. You can't have a market economy without property rights. So an economy in which private individuals own things is central to what we do at the moment. Now, if you want to change the entire economy and you want to introduce a non-market economy, well, then you must say so. My guess is, on my reading of the South African public, that support for that type of economy among South Africans is probably less than 1%. So I think that 99% of South Africans, as your examples keep on saying, want to hang on to their houses, even if they're small houses. They obviously should be bigger houses. The majority of South Africans want a situation where if you buy something, it's your property and it's not the property of some government official. And that's why I'm absolutely convinced that wherever this controversy lands up, it is not going to land up with some change to the Constitution which says the state can come and take everybody's property away. At the most, what we're going to get is a change which says that in very specific circumstances, then the state can pay zero compensation, but then it will be described very clearly, and I can assure you that people like you or I or everybody who's watching this broadcast will not be affected by that because it wouldn't be aimed at us.
Definitely. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Dr. Professor Steven Friedman, giving us views there on land expropriation without compensation, and having a look at some of the questions that ordinary South Africans have been asking around this issue. We'll take a short break here on SABC's Newsroom. Do stay tuned.
An exciting opportunity and an absolute massive